All right. Talking real property. Rule in Shelley's case. We're in the future interest section of interest in real property. Rule in Shelley's case, rule against remainders in grantees' heirs. At common law, where a freehold estate, usually a life estate, was given to A by will or inter vivos transfer, and in the same instrument, a remainder was limited to the heirs or the heirs of the body of A, and the freehold estate and the remainder were both legal or both equitable. The purported remainder in the heirs was not recognized, and A took both the freehold estate and the remainder. The rule operated regardless of the grantor's intent to convert what would otherwise have been a contingent remainder in the heirs to a remainder in the ancestor. Why? Reason why is because there's nowhere. Where's the Latin? Nemo est heres viventis. No one is an heir of the living. I want to say that, but and I kind of want to just avoid all these stupid examples. A for life, and then to the heirs of A, to A for life, then to B for life, then to the heirs of A, to A for life, then to B for life, then to the heirs of B. So they're saying for that one, the rule in Shelley's case operates as does merger, and B has a vested remainder in fee simple, right? Because it went to A for life, then to B, then to the heirs of B. So that's how B benefited here. But fourth example, to A for life, then one day after A's death to the heirs of A. So the rule in Shelley's case does not operate because the interest limited the heirs of A is interest limited to the heirs of A is not a remainder. It can never take over immediately at the termination of the prior freehold estate, but rather is an executory interest, right? Because there's interruption, like that one day after A's death to the heirs of A. Compare. O conveys land to A and his heirs. A takes a fee simple, not by the operation of rule in Shelley's case, but because the words and his heirs are words of limitation denoting that a fee simple estate has been conveyed. It is a common student error to conclude in this case that A takes a fee simple because the rule in Shelley's case. Yeah, I'm sure they're thinking that. This rule is triggered only by the attempted creation of a remainder in the grantee's heirs. And note, this rule has been abolished in most states today, but arises occasionally where a conveyance was executed prior to abolition of the rule. Part F, Doctrine of Worthier Title. Rule against remainders and grantors' heirs. Under the Doctrine of Worthier Title, a remainder limited to the grantor's heirs is invalid, and the grantor retains a reversion in the property. The doctrine is still applied to the inter vivos transfer in a majority of states, but most states treat it only as only as a rule of construction. For example, it does not apply if the grantor has clearly manifested an intent to create a future interest in his heirs. Examples: O deeds property to A for life, and on A's death to my heirs at law. Or, and on A's death to my next of kin. In most states, the disposition gives A life estate and presumptively leaves a reversion in fee simple in O. The burden of establishing that O really intended to create a remainder in his heirs or next of kin would be on the party so contending. The litigation would arise after O's death and would be between Romanet 1, the person is designated as O's heirs under the state intestacy laws, claiming that they take on A's death by remainder, and Romanet 2, the devisees under O's will, contending that O died owning a reversion. In a state that has abolished the doctrine, the state of title is life estate in A, contingent remainder in O's heirs, reversion in O. O deeds property to A for life, and on A's death to my children in equal shares. On O's death, his children, X and Y, are O's sole heirs. The doctrine of worthier title does not apply. The doctrine applies only when there is a disposition following a life estate to the transferors, heirs, or next of kin, or words of like effect. O deeds property to A for life, and on A's death to the heirs born to my wife Martha and me. The doctrine of worthier title does not apply. The disposition creates a life estate in A and a vested remainder subject to open in the children of O and Martha. Executory interests. This is a kind of a new section, so if that didn't make any sense, that's fine. It's rare that these things come up, and I would never, ever describe it that way in my own words. So let's just kind of read the top line again of both of these. The rule in Shelley's case is a common law rule where the freehold estate, usually life estate, is given by will or inter vivos transfer, and in the same instrument, a remainder was limited to the heirs of the body of the grantor. And the freehold estate and the remainder were both legal and both equitable, and the purported remainder in the heirs was not recognized, and A took both the freehold estate and the remainder. So this was operated regardless of the grantor's intent and converted what otherwise would have been contingent remainders in the heirs into a remainder in the ancestor. It's abolished in most states, so whatever. I just can't believe this is the thing. Okay, and doctrine of worthier title. But remainders are hard enough. The doctrine of worthier title, a remainder limited to the grantor's heirs, is invalid, and the grantor retains a reversion in the property. This doctrine is still applied to inter vivos transfers in a majority of states, but most states treat it only as a rule of construction. Thus, it doesn't apply if the grantor has clearly manifested an intent to create a future interest in his heirs. So you see how they're different. And Shelley's rule is like much harder because it is converting a contingent remainder in heirs to a remainder in the ancestor, and we're talking remainders confusing. So here we're talking remainders in the heirs turns into a reversion, which makes more sense, at least for me. Executory interest. Here is a good shorthand rule for classifying executory interests. Remember that there are two and only two future interests that can be created in a transferee. Actually, before you go on, let me just read the definition of remainder again, because there's vested, there's contingent, but just the plain old and subject to total divest, vested subject to open, vested subject to total divestment. These are all these kinds of remainders, but it's important to first of all know reversionary interests are always vested. Remainders, however, is a future interest created in a transferee that is capable of taking in present possession and enjoyment, i.e. capable of becoming a present interest upon the natural termination of the preceding estates created in the same disposition. So, a couple things interesting about that is can never be cut. Remainder cannot cut short or divest a preceding estate prior to its normal expiration, and it can never follow a fee simple, which has a potentially infinite duration. So, when you think about remainder, the definition there, and then you see how it is affected by the rule in Shelley's case and the doctrine of worthier title, it makes a bit more sense. So moving on to executory interest, here is a good shorthand rule for classifying executory interest. Remember, there are two and only two future interests that can be created in a transferee: remainders and executory interests. If it is not a remainder because the preceding estate is not a life estate, then it must be an executory interest. So if it is not a remainder because the preceding estate is not a life estate, then it must be an executory interest. What did I just say? A remainder can't follow fee simple. Therefore, we're talking it's not a remainder. The executory interest is can be identified because it's not a remainder, and because the preceding estate is not a life estate. Remainders follow life estates terms of years and fee tails which don't exist anymore. And then therefore, it must be an executory interest. Thus, an executory interest is any future interest in a transferee that does not have the characteristics of a remainder, i.e., it is not capable of taking on the natural termination of a preceding life estate. More specifically, an executory interest is an interest that divests the interest of another, right? Because that's one thing a remainder cannot do. So, cool, I read that. Shifting executory interest divests a transferee. That's your shifting. We're going to talk about springing executory interest, which follows a gap or divests a transferor. So, that's all different. A shifting executory interest is one that divests the interest of another transferee. Example, it cuts short a prior estate created by the same conveyance. Examples: to A and her heirs, but if B returns from Canada, then and in that event to B and his heirs. A has a fee simple subject to an executory interest because the future interest is created in a transferee. It has to be either a remainder or an executory interest. B's future interest is not a remainder because it does not follow the natural termination of the preceding estate. Here, A's fee simple estate. If B's interest does take in present possession, it will divest A's fee simple. This title will shift to B. O conveys, here's another example. O conveys to A for life, remainder to B and his heirs. But if B predeceases A to C and his heirs, C's interest does not await the expiration of B's remainder, but instead may cut it short. If at all, right? If B even predeceases A. That's a stupid example. Springing executory interest follows a gap or divests a transferor. A springing executory interest is an interest that follows a gap in possession or divests the estate of the transferor. Example: O conveys property to A when and if A marries B. State of title, fee simple, subject to an executory interest in O. Springing executory interest in fee simple in A. A's interest is not a remainder because if A's future interest becomes a present interest, if A marries B, it will divest O's fee simple. Because it divests the estate of the transferor, it is a springing executory interest. Why? O conveys property to A when and if A marries B. That's crazy. That's a crazy one. O conveys property to A for life and 1 year after A's death to B. A has a life estate. O has a reversion. B has a springing executory interest in fee simple. B's interest cannot be a remainder because of the 1 year gap. It is not capable of taking on the natural termination of the preceding estate, which is A's life estate. It is therefore an executory interest. It is springing executory interest because it springs out of the transferor's reversion. Executory interest follows a fee. A remainder cannot follow a fee simple interest of any kind. Therefore, an interest that follows a fee and is held by a third person is an executory interest. For example, O conveys land to church for so long as the premises are used for church purposes. And they shall never cease to be so used then and in that event to the American Red Cross. And if they shall ever cease to be so used, then in an event to the American Red Cross, charge has a fee simple determinable subject to an executory interest. The Red Cross has an executory interest that is valid under the charity to charity exception to the rule against perpetuities. So fee simple determinable, but subject to an executory interest. So, I mean, that tells you what type of a grant it is. That's weird, though. Because if you remember the types of grants, talking fee simple determinable, which the correlated future interest is the possibility of reverter. The other is fee simple subject to conditions subsequent with the correlated future interest of right of entry. And then lastly, you have the fee simple subject to an executory interest. So the fact that you have an executory interest doesn't mean necessarily that you have a fee simple subject to an executory interest. Even though that very same example appears here, that's not what you have. You have a fee simple determinable. And you don't really, I mean, maybe it's both, but it just says here it's a fee simple determinable subject to an executory interest. So that would be your correlative future interest rather than a right of reversion. And otherwise, I don't know why it wouldn't just be stated as a fee simple subject to an executory interest. It's a fee simple determinable subject to an executory interest. Anyway, what there is more to note is the Red Cross has an executory interest that is valid under the charity-to-charity exception to the rule against perpetuities. Because if it was to like a person rather than another charity, it would fail because it's not certain to vest within 21 years of a life from being at the time of the grant. Anyway, differences between executory interests and remainders. It is important to be able to distinguish between executory interests and remainders for the following reasons. Ruminant 1, executory interests are not destructible, while contingent remainders are still destructible in a few jurisdictions. Executory interests are not considered vested, whereas contingent remainders can become vested. And ruminant 3, the rule in Shelley's case does not apply to executory interest, but it does apply to remainders limited to the heirs of the grant. So those are important differences that are going to help you know the difference between remainders and executory interests. I'm going to read them one more time since I'm never going to remember any of that. 1, executory interests are not destructible. Find that hard to just take on its face, but while contingent remainders are still destructible in a few jurisdictions. I'm pretty sure contingent remainders are like to a life remainder to be if he survives it or something like that. But whereas contingent remainders can become vested. So that contingent remainder we were talking about can become vested if it was like to A for life, then to be if he reaches the age of 20. And yeah, then it's vested when he reaches the age of 20. And third, the rule of Shelley's case does not apply to executory interest, but it applies to remainders limited to the heirs of the grantee. So I don't think that I'm ever going to see that example and need to know that difference. Importance of classifying interests in order. Future interests are classified clause by clause, which will often mean that a label appended to the first future interest created in the disposition will determine the label to be appended to a second future interest created in the same disposition. For instance, if the first future interest is a contingent remainder, subsequent future interests must also be contingent remainders. Similarly, if the first future interest is a vested remainder, subject to divestment, the following future interests will be executory interests. That might be one worth memorizing to help try to identify differences between these. These are like clues. There's like a lot of examples. O conveys land to A for life and on A's death to B if B survives A. But if B does not survive A on A's death to C. A has a life estate. B has a contingent remainder because B's taking is subject to a contingency expressed in condition precedent form, and B must survive A in order to take. C has an alternative contingent remainder. Not an executory interest. And why not an executory interest? Here's something written here. Executory interests are not considered vested. Executory interests are not destructible. So that's what it is. C's interest could be destroyed by B predeceasing A. I'm sorry, B surviving A. So, therefore, C cannot have an executory interest, which would be whatever. Because the contingency of B's survival is expressed as both a condition precedent and in the next clause as a condition subsequent, why is B's remainder classified as contingent rather than as vested subject to total divestment? The explanation is that interests are classified in order. Looking first at the clause giving an interest to B, here the contingency is expressed as a condition precedent. Therefore, B's remainder is contingent. Then, having classified B's interest, we turn to C's interest. But because B's interest has already been determined to be contingent remainder, C's interest is necessarily an alternative contingent remainder. So, if none of that made sense, let me read this again. To A for life and on A's death to B if B survives A, but if B does not survive A, on A's death to C. Next example. O conveys land to A for life and on A's death to B. But if B predeceases A on A's death to C. Watch this one carefully, for the answer turns on the principle that we classify interest in order. First of all, A has a life estate. Next, we classify interest in... First of all, A is a life estate. Next, we classify B's interests. It is a remainder, for it is capable of taking on the natural termination of the preceding estate, A's life estate. It is a vested remainder in fee simple because B is an ascertained person and there is no remainder in fee simple because B is an ascertained person and there is no condition precedent to B's taking other than the termination of A's life estate. Having classified it as a vested remainder, we read on but if, and C that B's estate will be defeated if he predeceases A. Therefore, it is a vested remainder subject to total divestment upon the happening of this condition, which is expressed in condition subsequent form. Okay. Having classified B's remainder as vested subject to total divestment, we turn to C's interest. It cannot be a remainder, but a remainder follows the natural termination of the preceding estate. B's estate, which is a vested remainder in fee simple, but no remainder can follow a fee simple, for a fee simple is an estate of potentially indefinite duration. If C does take, it will cut short B's vested remainder in fee simple sometime short of infinity. Therefore, C's interest is an executory interest, a shifting executory interest because it divests a transferee. I think that's wrong. I think that's wrong because he's never going to take from B because B uses contingents, not vested. B is only going to take if a fee simple if he survives A, and if he does take a fee simple, C will never take anything at all. So C, they say, is an executory interest. Okay, well, it's not a remainder. Alright. But isn't C's interest capable of taking on the natural termination of A's life estate if B predeceases A? Yes, but that does not affect our classification. A remainder is a future interest capable of taking on the termination of the preceding estate, and here the preceding estate is B's. Okay, so that kind of explains a bit. Is that B is right before it, therefore you have to tag it on to B, not A. A is before it also, but it would never follow, well, it would follow A and not B, so that's why it's so weird and confusing. Suppose some years after this disposition, B dies during A's lifetime. What is the state of title? The answer, life estate in A, indefeasibly vested remainder in C. Now that B's estate is out of the way, the preceding estate is A's life estate. And so now we can change the label and call C's interested remainder. Transferability of remainders and executory interests. Vested remainders are transferable, divisible, and descendable. At common law and in all jurisdictions today, vested remainders are fully transferable during life, divisible by will, and descendable by inheritance. This is true of all types of vested remainders: indefeasibly vested, vested subject to open, and vested subject to total divestment. Contingent remainders and executory interests are transferable inter vivos. At common law, contingent remainders and executory interests are not assignable. While this is still the rule today, in a few states, most American courts hold that these interests are freely transferable. By who? I guess the person who owns it, according to the stated title. Contingent remainders and executory interests are usually divisible and descendable. Whereas the rule of common law was that contingent remainders and executory interests were not transferable inter vivos, it has always been held that these interests are divisible and descendable, unless, of course, the holder's survival is a condition to the interest's taking. Sure. All right. All right, so you just kind of have to know historically that, and I feel like if you really were like the judge, would you have to ask yourself when the grant was made, if common law still applied, to determine if the contingent remainder or executory interest is transferable inter vivos or not? Because there's some courts, that have navigated away from common law and are going to hold that these interests are freely transferable. And there's some that are not, and they're going to apply the common law, but, regardless or dependent on when the grant was made, I think, or I don't know. Maybe when the grant was made, maybe when the transfer was made. It's hard to say. But the fact is, these three section titles, there's actually 5 here. I'm going to read the section titles one more time. Under transferability of remainders and executory interests, to make sense in your mind that vested remainders are transferable, divisible, and descendable. That's the vested remainders. The contingent remainders and executory interests are transferable inter vivos in most American courts now, but never in common law. Whereas contingent remainders and executory interests are usually divisible and descendable, but not right. And any transferable future interest is reachable by creditors. And 5th, practical ability to transfer marketable title. Technically, most states consider all types of future interest transferable, but in practice, those interests held by unborn or unascertained persons are not transferable because the courts will not appoint a guardian for purposes of conveying land. And we're going to see more about that in a later section, which I have said in Caliph's case, that I thought that some factors to overcome that by appointing a guardian ad litem would take place, but I can't confirm without knowing what page section law 5A3 1B info 5. Is it 5? 6. 6. A 1 statute of frauds application? No. 3 marketable title, page 45. Let's just find out if they give us the case name that makes it possible, because it's eating me up inside. There is no 1B. Oh, that's 3. 3A1A. There is no A1. I'm on page 46. A3. So there's no answer. The section they're referring to doesn't exist. So we're just going to go directly to the casebook on that one, because it is something to know. Anyway, let's go back to the example on these contingent remainders and executory interests that are usually divisible and descendable. To A for life and on A's death to B, but if B does not survive A, on A's death to C. The state of the title is a life estate in A, vested remainder subject to total divestment in B, and shifting executory interest in C. Suppose B dies in A's lifetime, leaving a will that divides all my property to Mrs. B. B's remainder interest does not pass under his will because by the terms of the disposition that interest failed when B died in A's lifetime. And then about creditors reaching transferred future interests, the rule followed in nearly all states is that if a future interest can, under the laws of the state, be transferred voluntarily by its owner, it is also subject to involuntary transfer, i.e., it can be reached by the owner's creditors by appropriate process. Class gifts. I want to keep reading to get to the trust introduction, but I'm not going to make it because I have to leave. And it's on like 4 pages from now. But you get back around to these reachable by creditors problem in trusts. Is basically saying if it can be transferred, then creditors can get it. If it can't be transferred, like for instance with a spendthrift clause, then it's protected from creditors, I think. But that's your trust law. So, class gifts. A class is a group of persons having common characteristic. Typically, they stand in the same relation to each other and some other person. Example: children, grandchildren, descendants, nephews, and nieces. In a gift to a class, the share of each member of the class is determined by the number of persons in the class. Definitional problems of children, heirs, issue, descendants, and class members in gestation are all set forth on the next page. I'm not sure that I think this matters enough to read it. Except that issue and descendants take per stirpes, which is like another wills and trusts term. And then class members in gestation. Okay, we get that. When the class closes and the rule of convenience. Is this it? And no class members alive at testator's death. Class stays open. Postponed gift. Class closes at time fixed for distribution. And disposition subject to condition of reaching given age. Rule of convenience is a rule of construction only. We get to a section called survival, express words of survival, implied contingency of survival, gifts to issue descendants or heirs, gifts to persons issue descendants or heirs imply a condition of surviving the named ancestor. So for the rule of convenience, when a gift is made to a group of persons generically described as a class, such as for someone's children, there is a possibility that other persons may be born who meet the class description. This raises the question, when does the class close? For example, when is the maximum membership of a class determined, such that persons born thereafter are excluded from sharing the gift? In resolving this problem, the common law courts have developed a rule of convenience. This is a rule of construction, not a rule of law. It is applicable in the absence of an expression of intent to include all persons who meet the class description, regardless of when they are born. Under the rule, a class closes when some member of the class can call for the distribution of her share of the class gift. It is presumed that the ordinary transferor intends to include all members of the class whenever born, provided that this would not cause any undue inconvenience. Thus, the rule of convenience is based on a policy of including as many persons in the class as possible, consistent with permitting a distribution of the property at the first opportunity without the necessity of a future rebate. Outright gift. Class closes at the time the gift is made. When a will makes an outright gift to a class, if any class members are alive at the testator's death, the class closes as of the date of the testator's death. I'm not reading any examples. No class members alive at testator's death, class stays open. If there are no members of the class living at the testator's death, all after-born persons who come in within the class designation are included. Thus, if T had bequeathed $100,000 to the children of John, and John had no children living at T's death or born within the period of gestation thereafter, then all of John's children, whenever born, are included, regardless of any possible inconvenience to keeping the class open this long. Postponed gift. Class closes at time fixed for distribution. When possession of and enjoyment of a gift are postponed, as where the gift follows a life estate, the class remains open until the time fixed for distribution, for example, death of the life tenant. Third, disposition subject to condition of reaching a given age. When there is a gift to a class conditioned upon the members attaining a certain age, the class closes when 1. The preceding estate, if any, terminates, and 2. The first class member reaches the specified age. That class member's minimum share should be determined and distributed to her when she reaches the specified age. Skipping all of those examples, which are going to be very important. For the last part of the rule of convenience is a rule of construction, right? So if the transfer explicitly sets forth the time when membership of the class is to be determined, or if he provides that all members of the class, whenever born, are to share in the gift, then his directions will govern. However, courts have a strong preference for application of the rule of convenience unless there's a fairly clear indication that it is not to govern. We were just talking about survival right before trust. So just to finish up, as a general rule, all future interests can pass at death by will or inheritance. Example, they are descendable and divisible. That's future interests. This is true unless the interest taking is subject to an express or implied contingency of survival. There's an example. I'm skipping it. Actually, I'll just read. To my sister Sue for life, and on Sue's death, to her children in equal shares. Express words of example number 2, to A for life, and on A's death to B, if B is then living, but if B is not then living, to C. Express words of survival. In each of the following examples, the italicized language imposes a condition precedent that the remainderman must survive the life tenant in order to take. To A for life, remainder to his surviving children. To A for life, and should he die, leaving children to such children. To A for life, and after the death of A, remainder the children of A then living. Implied contingency of survival, we read that. And now we get to trusts on page 25.